Hello and welcome to today's session. We continue to look at Walter Benjamin's essay, Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So, we go straight to section 10, where he talks about the feeling of strangeness, and he also compares this experience of art being mechanically reproduced to that of a mirror image, as you can see over here. The feeling of strangeness that overcomes the actor before the camera, as Pirandello describes it, is basically of the same kind of the estrangement felt before one's own image in the mirror. But now the reflected image has become separable, transportable. This is something that he's been trying to delineate even in the previous section about how the actor gets completely separated from the artist. And it is also about how the art form how the persona of the actor, in spite of this diminishing aura, there is a way in which the art form, the performance, it attains a certain kind of transportability, a certain kind of separability from the personality. And where is it transported? Before the public. Never for a moment did the screen actor cease to be conscious of this fact. And it is also about how he had already spoken about it, about how whenever the actor is facing the camera, which is his first audience, he or she is also conscious of the fact that there is an audience out there in the public to which this entire art form, this entire performance would be transported to at a later point of time. And here is when he also makes this comparison between the objects manufactured within the factory, and compares the actor, the performance, as something which is constructed within a studio setting as well. So, having said that, he moves on to the 11th section, where he talks about the power of the camera to penetrate reality. So, we have already seen how he talks about the camera as a mediating agency as well as the first audience, and now we find that in spite of the camera being just an object, there is a way in which camera is also able to penetrate reality in ways that other art forms have not been able to. Here's how he begins the 11th section. The shooting of a film, especially of a sound film, affords a spectacle unimaginable anywhere at any time before this. It presents a process in which it is impossible to assign a spectator to a viewpoint which would exclude from the actual scene such extraneous accessories as camera equipment, lighting, machinery, staff assistants, etc. So, it also he goes on to compare this comparison that he'd been trying to make between theatre and a screen actor, and he also tells us how the props, the entire setting in a theatre, it is visible, and there is a certain kind of an illusion which is created over there, we also realized. But at the same time when the setting is being shot through a movie camera and when it is being released as a film, we realize that there is more of reality over there. And this penetration into reality is something that technology affords. And he goes on to make this comparison with a magician and a surgeon as well. The magician, while he is performing on stage, he is not really touching the body. He is healing that body. He seems to assemble and reassemble the body, the different body parts. But the surgeon, what he does on the other hand, just like the camera is, he's penetrating into the body. So the camera has this uncanny ability to penetrate into reality, to intervene with reality in very cutting terms, just like a surgeon is able to penetrate into the human body and make changes over there. There is more about there is more of a real interface when it comes to a surgeon, when it comes to a camera and its techniques, than say a magician or a painter. So these sort of comparisons and these sort of analogies also help us realize the impact that camera, film, all of these things have been having on the function of art, the ways in which art has been undergoing a radical change under mechanical production and reproduction. And this ability to penetrate into reality, just like the ability of the surgeon to penetrate into the body of the man, this is considered as something which would revolutionize all kinds of artistic notions. And thus, for contemporary man, the representation of reality by the film is incomparably more significant than that of the painter, since it offers, precisely because of the thoroughgoing permeation of reality with mechanical equipment, an aspect of reality which is free of all equipment. So when finally when this art form is being produced before us, being presented before us, we find that you get a more real sort of an interface over there, which is devoid of equipment. And this kind of reality is achieved through the interface, through the intervention of equipment. And that is the greatest irony and the beautiful transformation that this performance undergoes. And this is what one is entitled to ask from a work of art. I reiterate the second part of that sentence. A thoroughgoing permeation of reality with mechanical equipment, an aspect of reality which is free of all equipment. So there is a way in which the human body and technology are able to interact with each other, have a dialogue with each other, and still present a kind of reality or the illusion of a reality which is devoid of all kinds of equipments. And this argument that Benjamin tries to pursue almost continually is that film is more significant now than painting. Art form which has a technological intervention, or an interface that seems to be more powerful, more potent than all kinds of art forms which were produced manually across the ages. In section 12, he wants us to focus on how enjoyment is inseparable from criticism, and film is also the kind of an art form which tries to bring these two together quite organically, the idea of enjoyment and the idea of criticism. Mechanical reproduction of art changes the reaction of the masses towards art, and this he brings out through this example of a painting and a film about the reactionary attitude towards a Picasso painting and the progressive reaction towards a Chaplin movie. And he wants us to position these two terms in dichotomous ways, the reactionary attitude and the progressive reaction. The progressive reaction is characterized by the direct, intimate fusion of visual and emotional enjoyment with the orientation of the expert. Such fusion is of great social significance. He is also trying to show us the social significance which is invested into films. The greater the decrease in the social significance of an art form, the sharper the distinction between criticism and enjoyment by the public. I hope you're able to see the equation that he's trying to highlight over here. If there is the distinction between criticism and enjoyment, there seems to be lesser. There seems to almost blur when you look at an art form like film. The conventional is uncritically enjoyed and the truly new is criticized with aversion, and this has been historically true with all kinds of art forms as and when art has been going through these evolutionary stages. With regard to the screen, the critical and the receptive attitudes of the public coincide. So there is a very thin line between enjoyment and criticism, because one thinks that one is more equipped to critique something that is very new rather than something which is very traditional, because one feels more equipped to deal with things that are more contemporary than things which are rooted in tradition, which are related to cult value, which have ritualistic and traditional significance. The decisive reason for this is that individual reactions are predetermined by the mass audience response they are about to produce, and this is nowhere more pronounced than in the film. Now look at the multiple ways in which Benjamin is trying to highlight the value of film as an art form, and how this technical and mechanical reproduction also aids this entire process of criticism, of enjoyment, of our ideas of responding to art forms. Again, the comparison with painting is fruitful. A painting has always had an excellent chance to be viewed by one person or by a few. The simultaneous contemplation of paintings by a large public, which is what happens in the case of a film. This is simultaneously watched by a large number of audience, which rarely happens with painting. Such as developed in the 19th century is an early symptom of the crisis of painting, a crisis which was by no means occasioned exclusively by photography, but rather in a relatively independent manner by the appeal of artworks to the masses. And these minute details that Benjamin pays attention to, they also attempt to situate these art forms in a very historical and material sense. And it also showcases the multiple ways in which certain kinds of art forms are designed to certain kinds of criticisms, and how there's a certain immunity which has always been there with the traditional forms of art, such as painting. Painting simply is in no position to present an object for simultaneous collective experience. So this simultaneous collective experience, which is now made available to film, he says it was possible for architecture at all times, for epic poem in the past, and for the movie today. And look at these, look at the trajectory that he's drawing over here. It is the collective experience of enjoyment, the collective experience of criticism is not entirely available to paintings except for in certain occasions in the 19th century, which he also thinks had led to a huge crisis. But this was always possible for architecture, the collective response, the collective viewing of something, and for epic poem which was performed to a larger audience, and now it is the movie. So there is a tradition, there's something very new, very technically new, technologically new about movie. At the same time, there is a way in which it could be historically and in a chronological sense positioned as well. Although the circumstance in itself should not lead one to conclusions about the social role of painting, it does constitute a serious threat as soon as painting under special conditions and, as it were, against its nature, is confronted directly by the masses. So films are seen as the art form which revolutionized the responses from the mass, which radically changed the way in which art is being conceived by the masses. In the churches and monasteries of the Middle Ages and at the princely courts up to the end of the 18th century, a collective reception of paintings did not occur simultaneously but by graduated and hierarchized mediation. The change that has come about is an expression of the particular conflict in which painting was implicated by the mechanical reproducibility of paintings. Look at this continuous tracing of chronology and history that we find over here. Although paintings began to be publicly exhibited in galleries and saloons, there was no way for the masses to organize and control themselves in their reception. And that is something which is entirely possible with today's movie watching experience. That's the same public which responds in a progressive manner toward a grotesque film is bound to respond in a reactionary manner to surrealism. So this fundamentally is the point that he is trying to drive home when he is comparing the audience of a painting and the audience of a film. The twin expressions, the twin responses of enjoyment and criticism, they can go hand in hand when it comes to film, but it does not sit together very neatly when it comes to a traditional form of art like painting. And more importantly, there is a progressive response, there is a progressive attitude that we find in response to movie watching, but it's more like a reactionary response when it comes to an art form like painting. In section 13, Benjamin draws our attention to how films have changed and deepened our optical apperception. So he's also telling us about how there is this continuous interpenetration of art and science in very mutual terms, where it becomes almost impossible to separate art from science, because this is very technology driven when one is talking about movie photography and things like that. And we also realize that there are new aspects of reality which are being revealed to us through close-up shots, which helps us to understand movement which is extended in time, or the slow motion movements, and about unconscious optics, new structural formations of the subject. So there are these many new things which are being introduced to us, through which we are able to also look at reality from a different perception altogether. As he himself points out, the circumstance derives its chief importance from its tendency to promote the mutual penetration of art and science, actually of a screened behavior item, which is neatly brought out in a certain situation. Like a muscle of a body, it is difficult to say which is more fascinating, its artistic value or its value for science. To demonstrate the identity of the artistic and scientific uses of photography, which heretofore usually were separated, will be one of the revolutionary functions of the film. So we find many things coming together which were hitherto seen as functions which were poles apart, things which were poles apart about the artistic and scientific uses of art, photography, film. These new techniques, they try to forge these new kinds of relationships between art and technology, between art and science, between aesthetic experiences and scientific experiences. He pertinently talks about how this entire process, about the close-ups, focusing on hidden details, exploring commonplace milieus, all of these, they extend our comprehension of the necessities which rule our lives. On the other hand, it manages to assure us of an immense and unexpected field of action. Even the very ordinary, they will get transformed into something else under a cinematic gaze, under a photographic gaze. And it also gives us a new aspect of reality. It reveals before us a new aspect of reality which was otherwise not available for consumption to the naked eye. And as this section ends, in section 13, he categorically states, the camera introduces us to unconscious optics as the psychoanalysis to unconscious impulses. So, looking through the lens of a camera, through different angles, through different settings of the lighting, through different processes of editing, there is the unconscious, an unconscious reality, an unconscious optics which is being revealed to us, just the way psychoanalysis had unraveled the unconscious impulses of the human mind. So there is always, and this also has this inherent belief that reality is not something which is there ready-made for you to consume. There are also many levels which could be unearthed through these interventions of technology, and this is something which is seen as an immense possibility that is being offered by these processes of mechanical reproduction. Section 14 is where he talks about the influence of Dadaism, and Dadaism, he says, was a movement which had by default challenged the idea of the aura, which had which already had achieved the destruction of the aura by focusing on already reproduced, and it also outreached the public in different ways. If you are familiar with the Dadaistic movement, you would also know what Benjamin means when he talks about this movement becoming very central to our understanding of mechanical reproduction of art form. And here he talks about how the Dadais attached much less importance to the sales value of their work than to its usefulness for contemplative immersion. The studied degradation of their material was not the least of their means to achieve this uselessness. Their poems are word salad containing obscenities and every imaginable waste product of language. Look at this focus on waste, on uselessness. I read this sentence to you again. The studied degradation of their material was not the least of their means to achieve this uselessness. So what the way in which art undergoes change is also radically challenging the usefulness of art. Centuries have, we've had centuries of writings which always looked at the function of art, the function of literature, what's the use value of literature, and here is a set of artists who are ready to forgo the very usefulness of literature, the very usefulness of any forms of any form of art. Here, uselessness is also seen as something to be achieved, something to be attained, and there's a lot of value attached to this identification of the function of art, which is not quote unquote entirely useful in any ways. And this democratization, this complete disregard for art which is useful, that's also something very, very challenging that Benjamin talks about. Dadaistic activities actually assured a rather vehement distraction by making works of art the center of scandal. One requirement was foremost to outrage the public. So here is a kind of art form which does not try to please its audience. On the other hand, it wants to stay useless and outrage the public. You look at the mass responses to this kind of artistic productions and how historically this has been very significantly tied up with mechanical reproduction. And he also says, in this historical process, while we are trying to situate these different processes, we also realize that contemplation had become a school for asocial behavior. And this is something that he also associates with the decline of the middle class. He is again back to this comparison, this alluring comparison between painting and movie or photography. Let us compare the screen on which a film unfolds with the canvas of a painting. The painting invites a spectator to contemplation. Before it, the spectator can abandon himself to his associations. Before the movie frame, he cannot do so. No sooner has his eye grasped the scene than it is already changed. It cannot be arrested. So the movement of from one frame to the other, that also does something to this perception, to this analysis, to this process of enjoyment and criticism. It's quite unlike the painting where something is, the moment it arrested over there and the audience can engage with it. But with the film, there is an overall engagement, but otherwise engaging with one particular shot, it is quite impossible. One needs to move on. The movement also dictates or influences this process of enjoyment and process of criticism. Duhamel, who detests the film and knows nothing of its significance, though something of its structure, notes the circumstance as follows: I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images. So the entire idea of comprehension, the cognition, everything undergoes a change when technology begins to intervene with artistic production. And the spectator's process of association in view of these images, it is indeed interrupted by their constant sudden change. This constitutes the shock effect of the film, which, like all shocks, should be cushioned by heightened presence of mind. By means of its technical structure, the film has taken the physical shock effect out of the wrappers in which Dadaism had, as it were, kept it inside the moral shock effect. So this comparison with Dadaism also makes perfect sense. It's not entirely about pleasing the audience in the way that for the last many centuries that the artists and critics have been trying to do, but it's also about shocking the public, to outrage the public with a constant movement, with something very, very refreshing, very, very new, which is beyond the comprehension, which beyond the cognition of the traditional ways in which human mind was trained to respond to art. So this final section, in section 15, Benjamin talks about how habits are formed in conditions of distraction, and dwells at length on these qualities of distraction and concentration, and how concentration is seen as the absorption of the viewer by the work, and distraction is the absorption of the work into the masses. And he also brings in architecture into this discussion and says that it is rooted in practical needs. So it doesn't appear like, say, Greek tragedy. There's always a use value, there is always a practical need, not like an epic poem which could always be replaced, which even its absence will not perhaps make much of a change to the relation between the masses and the art. And here he begins to talk about the significance of habit. And habit, Benjamin argues in this final section, is necessary to master the problems of human perception. And contemplation by itself is not sufficient in this entire process. And he talks about how film is the current means for encouraging distraction arts, because distraction art provides a force for mobilizing the masses by molding their habits covertly, and also by making them absent-minded examiners. There's a way in which, through this process of democratization, almost everyone is able to judge a film. Almost everyone is able to watch and analyze a film. It becomes far more easier than to say, look at a painting and evaluate it and assess it and respond to it. And there is a certain kind of a progressive reaction, as he already mentioned, which the film as an art form affords as well. So this is how he ends the final section, section 15. Reception in a state of distraction, which is increasing noticeably in all fields of art and is symptomatic of profound changes in apperception, finds in the film its true means of exercise. The film, with its shock effect, meets this mode of reception halfway. The film makes the cult value recede into the background. And this is something that, if you remember, Benjamin had been talking about from the beginning, this transition from the cult value towards the exhibition value, which dominates the current perception of art, the current evaluation of art. The film makes the cult value recede into the background, not only by putting the public in the position of the critic. So the public can also become the critic. The viewer can also become the critic. This is quite unlike the earlier times when the critic was a separate entity, who not every reader, not every viewer was equipped to become the critic, but these sort of distinctions are increasingly getting blurred. The mass could be the critic as well, which is what we see in this new age of mass media increasingly, which is how we see in this collective response, in this collective viewership that a medium like film also entails. Not only by putting the public in the position of the critic, and also by the fact that at the movies this position requires no attention. The public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. One need not be a trained critic to respond to a movie. One could be an absent-minded viewer and still the response still continues to matter. That is the kind of democratization that art has achieved in this age of mechanical reproduction. So the final epilogue, where he talks about how fascism aesthetizes politics, and the entire implication of this essay in our current understanding of art, about human perception, about our responses to various forms of art, and the need to situate art in a historical sense. That's something that we shall look at in the next and final session on this essay, Benjamin's essay, Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing you in the next class.